Dr. Byung-ho had always been the quiet type. Even when he worked for the Galactic Council as a xenobiologist, he preferred studying alien life forms to socializing with alien diplomats. While other humans were making speeches and negotiating treaties, he was in his laboratory, analyzing genetic samples and writing research papers. When the humans left the council, Byung-ho returned to Earth without fanfare. He set up a new laboratory in Seoul and continued his research using samples he had collected. Over 15 years of galactic travel, he thought his work was interesting but not particularly important to anyone except other scientists. He was wrong. The report Byung-ho published 6 months after the human exodus sent shockwaves through both human and alien scientific communities. It was titled Hidden Dependencies Analysis of Galactic Species Interactions, and it revealed something that nobody had ever suspected. The galaxy had been secretly dependent on human abilities for far longer than anyone realized. Byung-ho had spent years studying the genetic and psychological profiles of every major galactic species. He was fascinated by how different civilizations had evolved different mental strengths and weaknesses. The Centaurians were incredibly logical but completely inflexible. The Rigelians were masters of detailed analysis but terrible at seeing big picture connections. Each species had developed amazing abilities in specific areas, but they had also developed massive blind spots in other areas. This was normal for any species that evolved in isolation on a single planet. What was not normal was how well these species had learned to work together. Despite their differences, the Galactic Council represented dozens of civilizations that should have been completely unable to communicate with each other. Their brains worked in fundamentally different ways. Their cultures were based on incompatible values. Their languages did not even have words for concepts that other species considered basic, yet somehow they had built a peaceful galactic civilization that lasted for thousands of years. How was that possible? Byung-ho found the answer in his analysis of human psychological profiles. Humans were not the smartest species in the galaxy. They were not the strongest or the most technically advanced. But they had one ability that no other species possessed to the same degree: cognitive flexibility. Other species were specialists. Their brains were optimized for specific types of thinking. They were incredibly good at certain tasks but struggled with anything outside their areas of expertise. Human brains were different. They were generalists. They could adapt their thinking style to match whatever problem they were facing. When working with logical Centaurians, humans could think in pure mathematical terms. When dealing with emotional Zephyrians, humans could focus on feelings and relationships. This made humans natural translators between species that could not understand each other directly. A Centaurian engineer and a Rigelian artist might have brilliant ideas to contribute to a project, but they literally could not communicate those ideas to each other. Their brains processed information in completely different ways, but a human could understand both perspectives. They could take the engineer's logical framework and translate it into the artist's creative language. They could find the common ground between approaches that seemed totally incompatible. For decades, humans had been unconsciously serving as cognitive bridges throughout galactic civilization. Every major diplomatic success had involved human negotiators who could understand all sides of complex disputes. Every technological breakthrough had come from mixed species teams, where humans helped different specialists share their knowledge. Every stable system in the galaxy depended on human flexibility to keep it running smoothly. Byung-ho's report included thousands of specific examples. The Zephyrian agricultural revolution had happened because human botanist Jung-woo could understand both Zephyrian environmental philosophy and Andromedan genetic engineering. The peace treaty that ended the Outer Rim conflicts had been written by human diplomat Minsu, who could think like both militaristic Rigelians and pacifist Aquarians. Even the basic structure of the Galactic Council had been designed by human political theorist Yunji, who somehow managed to create a system that satisfied the hierarchical needs of some species while respecting the democratic values of others. The report showed that humans were not just another member species of galactic civilization. They were the invisible foundation that made galactic civilization possible in the first place. This revelation explained why everything started falling apart so quickly after humans left. It was not just that humans had been doing important jobs. It was that humans had been doing jobs that literally no other species could do. The Xanthari mining operation failed because no other species could improvise solutions the way human technician Sung-min had done. The trade network collapsed because no other species could read market psychology the way human economist Yuna had done. The diplomatic corps fell apart because no other species could bridge cultural gaps the way human negotiators had done. Byung-ho's report spread rapidly through both the human colonies and the remaining galactic networks. Human leaders read it with growing understanding of why their species had always felt frustrated working within council structures. They had been doing the hardest and most essential work while receiving the least recognition and respect. Alien leaders read it with growing horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had not just lost a useful member species. They had lost the one species that made their entire civilization possible. The Valkyrian ambassador, who had pushed so hard to expel humans, was found dead in his quarters 2 days after reading the report. The official cause was listed as cardiac failure, but everyone knew he had died of shame and despair. The speaker called an emergency session to discuss the implications of Byung-ho's findings. For the first time in council history, the debate was conducted in complete silence. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit that they had destroyed their own civilization through pride and stupidity. Finally, the eldest member of the council stood to speak. She was a Zarian philosopher who had served for over 2 centuries. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone strained to hear her words. She said that the council faced a choice. They could continue pretending that the crisis was temporary and that they could solve their problems without human help. Or they could acknowledge the truth and figure out how to survive in a galaxy where they were no longer the dominant power because humans were not coming back. That much was clear from the failed diplomatic mission to Earth. Humans had moved on and were building something new with species that valued their contributions. The remaining council species could either learn to work with this new human-led alliance as junior partners, or they could fade into irrelevance as their systems continued to collapse. It was not really much of a choice at all. The Zarian philosopher sat down and the council chamber remained silent for a long time. Outside the windows they could see the lights of ships departing for human space. Former council colonies and member species were abandoning the failing galactic government to join the growing alliance that offered them hope for the future. The age of the galactic council was ending. The age of human leadership was just beginning, and there was nothing the old powers could do to stop it. 2 months had passed since the humans left the Galactic Council. What started as small problems was now turning into a galaxy-wide disaster. The great library of Zarian was burning, not with actual fire, but with something much worse. Data corruption was spreading through the ancient computer systems like a plague. 10,000 years of galactic history and knowledge was disappearing bit by bit. The Zarian archivists were running around their massive halls in complete panic. Their long blue tentacles were waving frantically as they tried to save whatever files they could. But they did not understand how their own systems worked anymore. For 8 years, a human woman named Kyung-hee had been the head archivist. She was quiet and patient and spent most of her time alone with the old computers. The other archivists thought her job was boring. They preferred working with visitors and giving tours and writing research papers, but Kyung-hee loved the old systems. She understood how they had been built layer by layer over thousands of years. She knew which parts were fragile and needed careful handling. She knew which backup systems were reliable and which ones were just for show. Most importantly, she had spent years creating her own backup network. Not the official one that everyone knew about, a secret system that copied the most important files to hidden servers all across the galaxy. The Zarian computers were incredibly advanced, but they were also incredibly old. They had been upgraded and modified so many times that nobody really understood how they worked anymore. The original builders were long dead. The documentation had been lost in wars and accidents. Only Kyung-hee had taken the time to trace every cable and study every circuit. She had drawn maps of the data pathways and written notes about which systems talked to which other systems. She had even learned the ancient programming languages that were used to build the core databases. Now she was gone and the Great Library was dying. The corruption had started in the oldest sections. Files that contained the history of the first galactic civilizations began showing strange errors. Names changed randomly. Dates became scrambled. Entire paragraphs turned into meaningless symbols. The Zarian technicians tried to fix the problems using standard repair protocols. But every time they touched something, two more things would break. They were like children trying to perform surgery with hammers. Within days, the corruption had spread to the newer sections. Scientific databases became unreadable. Literary works turned into gibberish. Even the library catalog system stopped working properly. Millions of researchers across the galaxy suddenly found themselves cut off from the knowledge they needed. Medical scientists could not access treatment records. Engineers could not find technical specifications. Historians could not verify basic facts about their own civilizations, but the Great Library disaster was just the beginning. The same day that Zarian sent out its first distress call, another crisis erupted on the other side of the galaxy. A massive asteroid was heading straight for the Zephyrian homeworld. The asteroid was 3 kilometers wide and moving at incredible speed. Impact calculations showed it would hit the planet in exactly 14 days. The explosion would kill every living thing on the surface and throw so much dust into the atmosphere that the planet would freeze solid. 20 billion Zephyrians were about to die. The Galactic Emergency Response Network sprang into action. This was exactly the kind of crisis they had been created to handle. They had the best ships, the best weapons, the best scientists from dozens of different species, but they could not organize themselves to save their own lives. The problem was not lack of resources. The galaxy had more than enough firepower to destroy the asteroid. They had ships that could push it off course. They had scientists who could calculate the exact trajectory needed to save the planet. The problem was coordination. Each species had their own military structure, their own command protocols, their own way of communicating during emergencies. The Rigelians wanted to use nuclear weapons to blast the asteroid into smaller pieces. The Centaurians preferred to use gravity tractors to slowly change its course. The Andromedans thought they should evacuate the planet instead of trying to stop the asteroid. Every species had a different opinion about the best solution. Every species insisted their approach was the only logical one. Nobody could agree on who should be in charge of the operation. For the past 6 years, a human coordinator named Jae-sung had been the invisible backbone of the emergency response network. He was not the official leader. That job belonged to a rotating council of senior military officers from different species, but Jae-sung was the one who actually made things work. When the Rigelian admiral gave an order, Jae-sung would translate it into terms the Centaurian captains could understand. When the Andromedan scientists submitted a report, Jae-sung would summarize it in a way that the Zephyrian engineers could use. He spoke 17 different languages fluently. He understood the cultural differences that affected how each species approached problems. He knew which officers were reliable and which ones were more interested in personal glory than saving lives. Most importantly, he knew how to make compromises that everyone could live with. When species disagreed about tactics, Jae-sung would find solutions that combined the best parts of each approach. He was like a translator who worked with ideas instead of words. Now, Jae-sung was back on Earth and the emergency response network was falling apart. The first coordination meeting lasted 18 hours and accomplished nothing. The Rigelian admiral walked out after the Centaurian general called his plan barbaric. The Andromedan fleet commander refused to take orders from anyone who ranked lower than herself in her own military hierarchy. By the time they finished arguing about who was in charge, 3 precious days had been wasted. The asteroid was 11 days away from impact. The second meeting was even worse. Now everyone was panicking. The Zephyrian representatives were begging for help while the other species blamed each other for the delays. Several admirals actually started shouting at each other in their native languages. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, yet another disaster was unfolding. The Rimworld crisis had exploded into open warfare. The Rimworlds were a collection of small colonies on the edge of galactic civilization. They were poor and isolated, but they controlled important shipping lanes that connected the inner systems to the resource-rich outer territories. For months, tensions had been building between the Rimworld colonies and the major trade corporations. The corporations wanted to build automated shipping stations that would bypass the colonies entirely. The colonists knew this would destroy their economies and leave them completely dependent on corporate charity. It should have been a simple negotiation. The corporations needed the shipping lanes. The colonies needed economic security. There was obviously a deal to be made that would benefit everyone, but the negotiations had been handled by traditional diplomatic corps using standard protocols. They scheduled formal meetings months in advance. They insisted on following proper procedures for every discussion. They spent weeks arguing about the exact wording of proposed agreements. The human negotiator, Su Young, would have solved the whole thing in 2 weeks. She had a gift for reading people and understanding what they really wanted beneath all their official positions. She could sense when someone was bluffing and when they were genuinely desperate. She knew how to make each side feel like they were winning even when they had to give up something important, but Su Young was gone and the diplomatic corps was failing miserably. The formal negotiations dragged on for months with no progress. The corporations grew impatient and started making threats. The colonists became desperate and began forming military alliances. What should have been a trade dispute was turning into a war. The fighting started with a few mining station raids. Then corporate security forces retaliated against colonial shipping. Within weeks, both sides were using military vessels and the conflict was spreading to neutral systems. The Galactic Council was facing simultaneous crises on multiple fronts. The Great Library was dying. An asteroid was about to destroy a major homeworld. A war was expanding across the Rim territories. And emergency reports were flooding in from dozens of other systems where critical infrastructure was failing. The speaker called an emergency session. For the first time in Council history, representatives from all species gathered within 6 hours, instead of the usual 6 weeks. But even in crisis mode, they could not agree on priorities. Should they save the Great Library first or focus on the asteroid threat? Should they intervene in the Rimworld war or concentrate on the infrastructure failures? The Valkyrian ambassador was no longer smiling. He stared at the growing pile of emergency reports and felt something he had not experienced in decades: fear. For the first time since the humans left, he began to wonder if maybe they had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late for second thoughts. The galaxy was coming apart and nobody knew how to put it back together. The Galactic Council had finally swallowed their pride. After watching their civilization crumble for 3 months, they decided to send envoys to Earth. They needed the humans back, and they needed them now. The speaker herself led the delegation. She had never visited Earth before. In fact, she had never thought Earth was worth visiting. It was just another small blue planet on the edge of nowhere with primitive inhabitants who had barely learned to travel between stars. Now she was flying toward that same primitive planet in the fastest ship the Council could find. With her were 5 other senior ambassadors, including the Valkyrian, who had pushed so hard to get rid of the humans in the first place. They expected to find a broken civilization. Humans cut off from galactic trade and technology should have been struggling to survive. Their economy should have collapsed without access to interstellar markets. Their colonies should have been failing without support from the galactic infrastructure. Instead, they found something that shocked them too. Their core. Earth was thriving. The orbital stations around the planet were busier than ever. Massive construction projects were underway in the asteroid belt. New colonies were being established at a rate that seemed impossible for such a young species. Commander, hey, one met them at the main space station above Earth. She had been just a junior officer when the humans left the council. Now she wore the uniform of the Independent Earth Defense Force and carried herself with quiet confidence. The speaker tried to hide her surprise as HFY gave them a tour of the station. Everything was newer and more advanced than the council installations. The artificial gravity was smoother. The life support systems were more efficient. The computer interfaces were incredibly intuitive. HFY explained that without council regulations holding them back, human engineers had been free to innovate at their natural pace. They had redesigned everything from scratch using principles that the council had declared too risky or unconventional. The results spoke for themselves. Human ships could now travel twice as fast as council vessels. Human colonies could be established in half the time using a quarter of the resources. Human technology was advancing so rapidly that their newest inventions were already making their year-old equipment look obsolete. But the real shock came when they visited the diplomatic section of the station. The corridors were filled with alien species that the speaker had never seen before. Some were refugees from the war zones that had erupted after the humans left. Others were representatives from civilizations that the council had dismissed as too primitive for membership. These younger species had eagerly embraced human friendship and cooperation. They were trading technology and resources freely with Earth. They were learning human languages and customs. Some were even sending their best students to study at human universities. The Silicoid ambassador showed the council delegates his species' new energy production methods. The techniques had been developed in partnership with human scientists and were already producing more power per unit of fuel than anything the council had ever achieved. The Aquarian trade representative talked excitedly about the underwater cities her people were building using human architectural principles. The designs were so efficient that construction time had been cut by 70%. Most impressive of all was the new communication network that connected all of humanity's allies. It was faster and more reliable than the council's ancient systems. It could translate between dozens of languages in real time. It even included emotional context markers to help different species understand each other better. The speaker realized with growing horror that humans had not just survived their separation from galactic civilization. They had started building a better one. When the formal meeting finally began, the council delegates laid out their offer. They would restore human voting rights. They would give Earth a permanent seat on the ruling council. They would provide massive funding for human research projects. They would even make Tejo the new deputy speaker if humans would just come back and help save the galaxy. HFY listened politely to their entire presentation. Then she smiled and shook her head. She thanked them for their generous offer, but explained that humans were no longer interested in joining the council. They had found their own path and they were quite happy with it. The Valkyrian ambassador could not contain his frustration. He demanded to know how humans could be so selfish. Billions of beings were dying while humans played with their new toys. Did they have no sense of responsibility? Hey, one smile disappeared. She reminded him that the council had voted unanimously to strip humans of their rights. They had been told they were too primitive and emotional to participate in galactic governance. Now that same council wanted them to drop everything and save the galaxy that had rejected them. The speaker tried a different approach. She offered to make humans equal partners in rebuilding galactic civilization. They would have complete autonomy over their own affairs. The council would never again question human methods or dismiss human contributions, but it was too late for promises. HFY had heard similar words before. The council had a long history of making commitments when they needed help and forgetting those commitments once the crisis passed. She showed them detailed records of every time humans had been promised respect and recognition for their contributions. Every time those promises had been broken or ignored once humans were no longer needed. The council delegates spent 3 days on the station trying different arguments and offers. They promised wealth and power and permanent status. They threatened economic sanctions and military action. They even tried emotional appeals about their shared galactic heritage. Nothing worked. The humans had learned not to trust the Council's words. They judged the aliens by their actions instead, and those actions had shown consistent contempt for human capabilities and contributions. On their last day at the station, the delegates were given a farewell dinner. The meal was prepared by chefs from a dozen different species, all working together in perfect cooperation. The food was better than anything served at council banquets. During the meal, Haywan made a final offer of her own. If the council was genuinely interested in cooperation rather than domination, humans would be happy to share their new technologies and methods. But it would have to be as equals working together, not as servants following orders. The speaker was tempted to accept, but she knew the other council species would never agree. They were too proud to admit that humans might have better solutions to galactic problems, too set in their ways to change their ancient procedures. Too afraid of losing their privileged positions in the hierarchy, the council delegation returned to their ship knowing they had failed. As they prepared to leave orbit, they watched through the viewports as human ships departed for missions across the galaxy. Not to rejoin galactic civilization, but to build something new and better. Behind them, they were leaving a council that was slowly dying from its own inability to adapt and change. Ahead of them lay the promise of a galaxy where cooperation mattered more than protocol, and results mattered more than tradition. The speaker stared at the blue planet shrinking behind them and wondered if her species would survive long enough to see what humans built next. She was beginning to suspect that the future belonged to whoever was wise enough to work with humanity, rather than against them, but by then it might be too late for the Galactic Council to learn that lesson. 3 weeks had passed since the human delegation walked out of the Galactic Council chambers. The massive hall felt strangely empty without them. The other species barely noticed, though. They were too busy arguing about new trade regulations and tax policies. The Valkyrian ambassador was feeling quite pleased with himself. He had finally gotten rid of those troublesome humans with their wild ideas and emotional outbursts. Now the council could focus on proper civilized governance without constant interruptions. Meanwhile, on the mining planet Kepler 442b something was going very wrong. The Xanthari mining supervisor, Crixvolume, was staring at a wall of dead monitors in the control room. Red warning lights were flashing everywhere. The main drilling equipment had shut down completely. The transport tubes that carried workers up and down the mine shafts were stuck between levels. Most importantly, the life support systems were failing. 30,000 Xanthari miners were trapped underground. Crixvolume had been running this operation for 12 years. He was good at following procedures and maintaining schedules, but he had never been good at fixing things when they broke in unexpected ways. That had always been Sung Min's job. Seong-Min was the human technician who had worked at the mine for the past 4 years. He was young and sometimes talked too much, but he had a gift for making broken machines work again. He could look at a piece of equipment and somehow know exactly what was wrong with it. The official repair manuals were 3,000 pages long. They covered every possible problem and every approved solution, but Sung Min never read them. He just touched the machines and listened to the sounds they made. Then he would grab some spare parts and start working. The other technicians used to make fun of him. They said his methods were not scientific, not proper, not by the book, but Sung Min's repairs always worked. They worked better than the official methods. They lasted longer too. Now Sung Min was gone. He had left with the other humans when the council stripped their voting rights. The Xanthari had laughed when he packed his tools. They said they did not need a primitive human to fix their advanced technology. Crixvolume was not laughing anymore. He had tried everything in the repair manual. He had called the equipment manufacturer. He had even contacted the Galactic Engineering Guild. Nothing worked. The machines stayed broken. The life support systems would fail completely in 18 hours. After that, the miners would start dying. On the other side of the galaxy, another crisis was developing. The Galactic Trade Network was experiencing something that had not happened in decades. A complete market collapse. The network connected 47 different star systems. Each system had its own currency. Some used physical coins made of rare metals. Others used digital credits backed by energy reserves. A few still bartered with actual goods and services. For the past 8 years, a human economist named Yuna had been managing the complex exchange rates between all these different currencies. She worked 18 hours a day watching market trends and making tiny adjustments to keep everything balanced. The other species thought her job was simple. They figured it was just basic math. Currency A equals X amount of currency B, easy enough for a computer to handle. But Yuna knew better. She understood that markets were not just about numbers. They were about emotions, fear and greed and hope and panic. When the Rigelian harvest failed, traders would get nervous and start hoarding food credits. When the vegan shipwrights discovered a new asteroid field full of rare metals, the construction markets would go crazy with excitement. The computer systems could handle normal fluctuations, but they could not predict how different species would react to unexpected news. They could not read between the lines of trade reports. They could not sense when someone was lying about their reserves. Yun could do all those things. She had spent years learning how each species thought about money and trade. She knew that Centaurians were naturally cautious and would sell at the first sign of trouble. She knew that Andromedans were aggressive risk-takers who would double down on bad bets. She knew that Zephyrians valued stability above profit and would sacrifice gains to maintain steady prices. Now, Yuna was gone too. She had returned to Earth with the other humans. The automated trading systems were running the network by themselves. For 3 weeks everything seemed fine. The computers made their calculations and adjusted the exchange rates according to their programming. But then a minor shipping accident near the Proxima trade hub created a small shortage of manufactured goods. The computers saw the shortage and made a small adjustment to prices, nothing dramatic. Just a 2% increase to reflect the reduced supply. But the Rigelian traders saw the price increase and panicked. They remembered the great shortage of 2387 when prices had gone up 50 times normal levels. They started buying everything they could get their hands on. The computers saw the increased demand and raised prices again. This made the Centaurian traders nervous, so they started selling their reserves to get out before prices crashed. The sudden flood of goods for sale made the Andromedan traders think there was a conspiracy to manipulate the markets. They started spreading rumors about secret price-fixing agreements. Within 6 hours, 3 different star systems had banned trade with each other. The galactic trade network split into 5 separate smaller networks that refused to recognize each other's currencies. The economic chaos spread like wildfire. Planets that depended on imported food faced starvation. Colonies that sold raw materials to buy manufactured goods found themselves with worthless exports and no way to get the supplies they needed. Back at the Galactic Council, the first emergency reports were starting to arrive. The Xanthari delegation was demanding immediate assistance for their trapped miners. The Trade Federation was calling for emergency intervention to prevent total economic collapse. The speaker looked at the reports with growing confusion. How could so many different problems develop at the same time? Was this some kind of coordinated attack? The Valkyrian ambassador was equally puzzled. He studied the reports carefully, looking for connections. The mining equipment failure seemed to be a simple technical problem. The trade network collapse appeared to be caused by market panic. There was no obvious link between them, except for one small detail that most council members missed. Both problems had started in areas where humans used to work. But that had to be a coincidence. After all, humans were just one species out of dozens. They were primitive and emotional and unpredictable. How much difference could they really make? The council decided to send technical experts to help the Xanthari and economic advisors to stabilize the trade networks. Proper experts with advanced degrees and official certifications. Not like those human amateurs who just made things up. As they went along, the experts arrived at their destinations with detailed plans and sophisticated equipment. They studied the problems carefully and developed comprehensive solutions. Based on established scientific principles, none of their solutions worked. The mining equipment stayed broken. The trade networks remained collapsed. And more emergency Reports were starting to arrive from other parts of the galaxy. The speaker was beginning to feel the first stirrings of real concern, but she pushed those feelings aside. These were just isolated incidents, technical problems that would be solved in time. She had no way of knowing that across the galaxy dozens of other systems were starting to break down. Systems that had been quietly maintained by humans for years. Systems that everyone had taken for granted. The ripple effect was just beginning. Tejo walked into the huge council room and felt his heart sink. The massive hall was filled with strange creatures from all over the galaxy. Some had blue skin and 4 arms. Others looked like giant insects with wings. A few had tentacles instead of legs, but all of them had one thing in common. They all looked at humans like they were stupid children. The meeting had been going on for 3 hours. Tejo sat in the small human section with his friend Hyjin. She was the smartest person he knew. She had saved millions of lives by finding a cure for the deadly Andorian plague. But when she tried to speak today, the other aliens just ignored her. The Valkyrian ambassador was talking again. His voice was deep and cold. He had purple skin and eyes that glowed yellow. He was talking about how humans were too young to understand real politics, too emotional to make good decisions, too weak to be trusted with important jobs. Tejo felt his hands make fists. For 15 years, humans had worked with the Galactic Council. They had helped solve so many problems. When the Zephyrian homeworld was dying from pollution, humans found a way to clean their air. When 2 alien races almost started a war over mining rights, humans helped them make peace. When the great space station near Proxima Centauri was breaking down, human engineers fixed it in just 2 weeks. But the aliens always said humans got lucky. They said human solutions were too simple, too basic, not scientific enough. They acted like humans were just guessing and accidentally getting things right. Hyjin leaned over to whisper to Tejo. Her voice was shaking with anger. She had been working on a new medicine that could help 3 different alien species. But when she presented her research last month, the council said it was too dangerous. They said humans did not understand alien biology well enough. They gave her project to a Centaurian scientist instead. The Centaurian had been working on the same problem for 5 years with no results. Hyjin solved it in 6 months, but the council did not care. They said the Centaurian approach was more methodical, more proper, more scientific. Now, the Valkyrian ambassador was reading from a long list of complaints about humans. He said humans were too quick to act, too willing to break rules, too ready to try new things. He said this made them dangerous to galactic peace and stability. Tejo wanted to laugh. Humans were dangerous to peace? Humans had stopped more wars than any other species in the council. Human diplomat Su Young had prevented the Rim War just 2 years ago. She spent 3 months talking to both sides and finding a solution that made everyone happy, but the aliens did not see it that way. They said Su Young got lucky. They said she did not follow proper diplomatic protocols. They said a real diplomat would have taken 2 years to negotiate the same deal. The Valkyrian finished his speech and sat down. The council leader stood up. She was a tall, thin creature with gray skin and no hair. Her name was impossible for humans to pronounce, so everyone just called her the Speaker. The Speaker looked directly at Tejo. Her black eyes showed no emotion at all. She said the council had made a decision about humanity. The vote was complete. All 37 non-human species had agreed. Tejo felt his stomach drop. He knew what was coming, but he hoped he was wrong. The speaker announced that humans would lose their voting rights in the council, effective immediately. The reason was that humans were too emotionally unstable for important decisions, too unpredictable for galactic security, too primitive for advanced civilization. The room was completely quiet. Tejo could hear his own heartbeat. He looked at Hyjin and saw tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, angry tears. The speaker continued talking. She said humans could still serve the council. They could still do basic jobs. They could still help with simple problems. But they would not be allowed to vote on important matters. They would not be allowed to lead projects. They would not be allowed to represent their species in major negotiations. Basically, they were being turned into servants. Smart servants who could solve problems, but servants all the same. The Valkyrian ambassador smiled. It was a cold, cruel smile. He said this decision would make the galaxy more stable, more peaceful, more civilized. Te-Ho stood up slowly. Every alien in the room turned to look at him. He was not supposed to speak. The meeting was over. But he did not care about their rules anymore. He said just one word. No, the speaker looked confused. She asked what he meant. Te-Ho looked around the room at all the alien faces. Some looked curious, some looked annoyed, most looked bored. They thought this was just a human having an emotional outburst. Te-Ho said no again. He said humans would not accept this decision. They would not become second-class citizens. They would not be treated like children. The Valkyrian ambassador laughed. He asked what humans could possibly do about it. The vote was final. All species, except humans, had agreed. Humans had no choice but to accept it. That was when Hyjin stood up too. She was small compared to most of the aliens in the room, but her voice was strong and clear. She said the ambassador was right. Humans had no choice. So they were making a different choice instead. The speaker asked what she meant. Hyjin smiled for the first time that day. She said humans were leaving the council. All of them, forever. The room erupted in noise. Aliens were shouting and clicking and making strange sounds. Some were laughing. Others seemed worried. The speaker was trying to restore order, but Te-Ho was not listening anymore. He was already walking toward the exit. Hyjin was right behind him. They had work to do. As they left the council chamber, Te-Ho pulled out his communication device. He sent a message to Earth, to President Dongwu. The message was simple and direct. The council just voted to remove our rights. They want us to be servants. What are your orders? The reply came back in less than an hour. It was even simpler. Then Te-Ho's message, come home. We are done with them. Te-Ho showed the message to Hyjin. She nodded and started packing her research, all of it, every file, every sample, every piece of data she had collected while working for the council. The aliens would learn soon enough what they had lost. But for now, they were still celebrating their victory over the primitive emotional humans. They had no idea what was coming. 1 year after humanity left the Galactic Council, the old order was completely gone. What had taken thousands of years to build had collapsed in just 12 months. The Great Hall, where species once gathered to debate the future of civilization, now stood empty except for maintenance robots cleaning dust from abandoned seats. The speaker was one of the last to leave. She walked through the corridors that had once bustled with diplomats and translators and staff members from dozens of worlds. Now her footsteps echoed in the silence. She paused at the human section where Te-Ho and Hyjin had sat during that final meeting. Their chairs were still there, but they looked smaller than she remembered. It was hard to believe that two beings from such a young species had held so much power in their quiet competence. The council had officially dissolved 3 months earlier. The remaining member species had split into smaller groups based on geography and cultural similarity. Some were trying to maintain their old territories through military force. Others had retreated to their homeworlds and closed their borders to outside contact. A few had swallowed their pride and applied for membership in the new Terran Alliance. The alliance had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a partnership between humanity and a handful of younger species had become the dominant power in the galaxy. Their territory now included over 200 star systems and was expanding every month. Captain Ba'ura commanded the exploration ship that was making first contact with civilizations the old council had ignored or dismissed. She was young even by human standards, but she had learned diplomacy from masters like Te-Ho and Su-Young. She understood that every species had something valuable to offer, if you just took the time to listen. The latest species to join the alliance were the crystalline entities from the Magellanic Clouds. The old council had refused to even acknowledge them as intelligent life forms because they did not have biological bodies. But Ba'ura recognized their unique ability to process quantum information and welcomed them as Full members, the crystallines brought with them computational abilities that revolutionized Alliance technology. Their quantum minds could solve problems that would take biological brains millions of years to figure out. In partnership with human creativity and intuition, they were developing technologies that seemed like magic to the older galactic civilizations. The success of the Alliance was built on principles that the old Council had never understood. Every species was valued for their unique strengths rather than judged by their weaknesses. Leaders were chosen based on competence rather than political connections. Decisions were made through consensus and cooperation rather than majority votes that created winners and losers. Most importantly, the Alliance understood that diversity was a source of strength, rather than a problem to be managed. The more different perspectives you could bring to any challenge, the more likely you were to find an innovative solution. This philosophy was put to the test when the Alliance faced their first major crisis. A plague had broken out on the mining world of New Kepler. The disease affected multiple species in different ways, and was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. The old Council would have spent months forming committees and scheduling meetings and following established protocols for medical emergencies. By the time they acted, the plague would have spread throughout the galaxy. The Alliance response was swift and decisive. Human doctors who understood the emotional aspects of disease treatment worked with crystalline quantum computers that could model viral mutations in real time. Aquarium biochemists who specialized in waterborne pathogens collaborated with silicoid engineers who could build sterile containment facilities within 2 weeks. They had not only stopped the plague but developed treatments for all affected species. The cure was freely shared with every civilization in the galaxy, including the few remaining Council holdouts. This generous act of medical diplomacy convinced many fence-sitting species to join the Alliance. They could see that humanity and their partners were building something genuinely different from the old power structures. The former Council species watched these developments with growing desperation. Their territories were shrinking as colonies and protectorates defected to the Alliance. Their economies were failing without access to the new technologies being developed in human space. Their military forces were no match for Alliance ships that incorporated innovations from dozens of different scientific traditions. Some tried to fight back through sabotage and terrorism, but these efforts only drove more species away from them and toward the Alliance. It was clear that the old ways of thinking about galactic politics were not just obsolete but actively harmful. The Zephyrian homeworld, which had almost been destroyed by the asteroid that the Council could not organize to stop, became the site of the Alliance's new capital. The planet had been saved by a joint human crystalline mission that used quantum calculations to precisely redirect the asteroid into a stable orbit where it now served as a mining station. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Where the old Council had failed through bureaucracy and in fighting the new Alliance had succeeded through cooperation and innovation. President Dongwu of Earth was elected as the first Director General of the Alliance. It was a mostly ceremonial position since real decisions were made by consensus among member species. But it sent a clear message about humanity's role in the new galactic order. In his acceptance speech, Dongwu talked about the lessons humanity had learned from their time in the old Council. He spoke about the importance of respecting every voice and valuing every contribution. He promised that the Alliance would never repeat the mistakes of the past by dismissing any species as too primitive or too different to matter. The speech was broadcast throughout Alliance space and beyond. On worlds still controlled by former Council species, citizens gathered in secret to listen to words they had never heard from their own leaders. Words about cooperation and respect and building a better future together. Revolution was in the air. Not the violent kind that destroyed everything in its path, but the quiet kind that grew from hope and possibility. Species that had been kept in subordinate positions for millennia were discovering they had choices they never knew existed. The final blow to the old order came when the Valkyrian homeworld applied for Alliance membership. The species that had led the campaign to expel humanity was now begging to join the human-led Alliance. The irony was not lost on anyone, especially the humans who had once sat in the council chambers, listening to Valkyrian speeches about their primitive and emotional nature, but the Alliance accepted the Valkyrian application without hesitation. The new galactic order was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about building something better for everyone, including former enemies who were willing to change. The Valkyrian ambassador, who had replaced the one who died of shame, made a public apology on behalf of his entire species. He acknowledged that they had been wrong about humanity and wrong about the nature of galactic civilization itself. He promised that his people would work to earn their place in the Alliance through service and cooperation rather than demands and threats. It was a powerful moment that symbolized the transformation of galactic politics. The age of domination and hierarchy was ending. The age of cooperation and mutual respect had begun. The old Galactic Council was now just a footnote in history, a cautionary tale about what happened when pride and prejudice were allowed to overcome wisdom and cooperation. Future generations would study its collapse as an example of how even the mightiest civilizations could fall if they forgot the basic principles of working together, but they would also study the rise of the new Terran Alliance as proof that it was never too late to build something better, that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness, that the future belonged to those who were wise enough to value every voice and brave enough to try new approaches to old problems. At the center of it all were the humans, not as rulers or masters, but as partners and facilitators. They had not sought to dominate the galaxy, but to help it reach its full potential. They had turned their greatest weakness, their emotional and unpredictable nature, into their greatest strength by using it to bridge the gaps between species that could not understand each other. The galaxy was a bigger and brighter place because humanity had found the courage to walk away from a system that did not value their contributions and build something new that did, and this was just the beginning.